right, what's up, Nostalgia Trappers? Welcome to the program. David Parsons here. I hope you're ready for a very special episode of Nostalgia Trap. We're talking with Sean from the Antifada podcast. If you haven't checked out the Antifada podcast, I think Nostalgia Trap listeners especially will appreciate the way that they approach left-wing politics on that show. It's a really funny show, and it also has that sort of international vision that we're always whining here on Nostalgia Trap that no one does on the left. Antifada is doing it. So go check out their podcast. I've been wanting to talk with Sean for a while. We're both, I guess, Gen Xers, I guess. All that means to me is we both remember the 90s. And we wanted to sort of go back in time in this episode and think about oil and how oil played a very significant part in the wider American left in the 90s and early 2000s. We both watched this film, Syriana. Not sure if you've seen that. Go ahead and pause this, watch the film in its entirety, and then come back and join us. Because we do discuss that movie in detail. Syriana came out in 2005, directed by Stephen Gaghan. It's part of like that whole, like, I don't know, set of films that were both like documentaries and narrative fiction films that were sort of about like geopolitics and conspiracies. I guess Traffic, the Soderbergh film, would be another example where they're going into like a lot of detail about geopolitics. I was really drawn to Syriana at the time, and watching it again this week was a total mindfuck because it's still a really compelling film, and one that, as we get into here, captures a particular moment in which oil and oil politics seem to explain everything. So we get into like both the usefulness of that outlook and how things have changed since Syriana came out many years ago. So this was a super fun conversation, and I appreciate Sean coming on the show and talking with me. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, have you subscribed to our Patreon, by the way? If you have not subscribed to the Nostalgia Trap Patreon, you are missing out on some of our best stuff, including our Howard Zinn trilogy with Justin Rogers Cooper. We're still getting really amazing comments on those set of episodes. So go check those out, because I am still thinking about the Howard Zinn trilogy, honestly. We get into some really, I think, challenging and difficult contradictions within what we call being a leftist. So go check that out, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and enjoy this conversation about Syriana and oil politics with Sean from Antifada. All right, Sean. Well, this has been a long time coming. Great to see you, man. How are you?
Great to see you as well. I must say, and I think I might have told you this before, but I'll say it for the benefit of everybody. Yours was probably like the first podcast I think I ever really got into many, many years back. You're one of the old heads. You've been at it for how many years now?
I think I started in like 2013 or 14.
Wow, very early adopter.
Yeah. But that was before, I was just doing them, like putting them out every few months. Like I really didn't have like a whole lot of episodes. Now we're like a regular show that's on all the time. But I was just sort of like experimenting with podcast kits you could find on Amazon.com and finding out, like, I don't know, it was a weird world when it first started out. But
very weird. Yeah.
Thanks for saying that, by the way. That's really cool. I mean, that's part of why I put the voice out there, was to sort of like see if there were other people that were into this shit.
Well, you're a history guy, which is right up my alley too. I'm a failed history graduate student.
Nice. I'm a failed history PhD. So
perfect. You got a little farther in your failures than I did. I got out of before a master's, but I think we make some of the best.
Yeah, no, I agree. There was a guy on my block growing up who was like a history professor who everyone talked about as like the guy that never made it. You know, he got his PhD and then he sort of like dicked around, and he was sort of like the hippie professor. Everybody loved him, and I like aspired to be a part of that. Like, to me, like that was a cool life. The fact that he like didn't have a real job was cool.
Yeah, if you get sucked into like through the PhD, and you get sucked into like the glad handling and the real bureaucratic aspects of academia, I'm not saying there aren't great academics out there, great historians, of course, but it does do something different to you.
Yeah.
And I think we managed through failure to avoid that. So thank God.
There's a price to pay for success, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I became a carpenter, and you became what? A professional podcaster. So
Yeah, there you go. There are routes for everyone. I think like it's funny because like I literally did become a podcaster in part because I was at the end of my PhD and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't really have an opportunity to like talk about history as much as I want. So
to nerd out about history. It's all about nerding out. Like even as a failure, even as somebody who never made it to the end, to that terminal degree, I still need to keep my hands warm. I still need to stay involved in this stuff because I love it with a passion. I know you do too. It's just, and it's also, I feel like there's like a real lack out there in terms of good sort of like historical materialist thinking out there. So I'm happy to fill a little niche. If we fill a little niche, then that's great.
Yeah, let's niche it up. We were going to talk about this movie Syriana. I wonder if right at the outset, would you consider Syriana to be sort of like a spiritual sequel to Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood?
Ooh, interesting. Oh, I hadn't thought about that before.
Or is There Will Be Blood a prequel to Syriana?
It takes place in the same cinematic universe, maybe.
Right,
there's like instead of the Marvel cinematic universe, there's like the oil fuckery cinematic universe. I didn't think about it in those terms. So that's a really interesting way to think about it because we're going to talk about Syriana, but we're also, I think, going to try to put it in its historical context, where it got made, what it's about, why in 2003 was it? You know, this
2005.
2005. Wow, an even more important date for a what would you say, a morally complex and somewhat circumscribed analysis of all of the corruption, all the violence, and all the warfare that comes from the United States' implication in oil and foreign regimes. I mean, 2005 is a great time for that. You also want to talk about No Blood for Oil, right? That's the other context, because what does this movie mean about what politics were like at that moment?
Yeah, the reason why I thought about No Blood for Oil is because when I was coming up as a young person getting into politics and on the left scene, and by on left scene I just mean like reading political shit online. Yeah. Oil was a big deal, and like this was, I guess, during the Bush era. You know, people were talking about oil. And I know I'm not like the conversation goes back further than that, and probably as a popular conversation started in the 1970s around the oil shocks and wars in the Middle East, and the American public becoming increasingly aware of their lifestyles connected directly to this tenuous relationship to different nations in the Middle East, and that fueling a lot of terrorism and bad, nasty shit, including the only thing Americans care about, which is gas prices.
Yes.
So there was all that, but there was also like, I don't know. Do you remember like people talking about like peak oil and all that sort of thing too?
Yeah, I definitely do. It was interesting because that even goes back to the 90s. Like I have a kind of like theory about 90s into the 2000s that maybe we can explore, right? But there's
drop the theory.
there's all sorts of like oil is this petroleum is this lubricant for the world economy. It doesn't in and of itself, you know, I would argue as a Marxist, it doesn't in and of itself, like, at least doesn't sitting there by itself or even being burned, create anything of value. But when inserted as this essential part of our industrial society, it lubricates every single transaction, just about. It lubricates much of production and certainly a lot of consumer life. And so in the 70s, when the oil shocks happened, they were a psychological shock. They were a collective psychological shock. And I think a lot of the ways that Americans politically and culturally, sort of in a collective way, try to work out their anxieties about the economic present and the economic future is through oil. It's sort of this marker that exists, I think, for Americans. The gas prices that you mentioned are really important because we have a massive inflation going on right now because of this logistics, this supply chain crunch, and because of COVID-19 or whatever. Mm-hmm. Even if prices of some things go up, like houses, for example, which are important that everybody uses, even if they go up a factor or two more than gasoline, right, in people's lives, gasoline at the pump, it still becomes this sort of political very important political touchstone for Americans. So I think a lot of the way we understand our economy, understand the world economy in general, comes from this attachment we have to this particular product.
Yeah, and there was a lot of like, I don't know, there's a lot of like cringe like liberal documentaries about oil and about like the environmentalism and that sort of thing that came out around this time too.
Yeah.
I think it came with the force of revelation for me. Like I came to oil as sort of a magic elixir that helped me understand geopolitics. It was all of a sudden like, and I think there's a danger to that sort of thing, where it's sort of like, well, oil is the only sort of thing that explains what's going on. And there was definitely. I think there was a lot of that happening. And you know what's funny is I expected Syriana to fall into that genre, but I was sort of pleasantly surprised watching it last night at how nuanced a take they had on some of this stuff. It wasn't just a like, it's all about oil, man, like sort of conversation. It seemed like it was, I don't know, a genuine effort to try and reflect how complex all this is. And I know the film got criticized for being like overly complex and like impossible to understand.
I mean, how through American cinema or just popular cinema in general, can you be didactic and still make things entertaining? Because I found it to be a very entertaining movie. I liked all the intrigue. I liked the sort of moral quandaries that people were put in, and I certainly liked thinking about this in terms of our world today and the world 15 years ago. But like if you're gonna if you're gonna truly understand the politics and political economy of oil, you're not gonna be able to do it in a 2-hour movie.
Right.
So what does this movie do for us? What it does is I think it opens up, as you said, in a very sort of complex way, all the ways in which the things that America certainly says about itself in terms of our fairness, in terms of our political system and democracy. It shows how the implications, or let me just say, it shows how our collectively as a state, our power in the world blows back and corrupts the American process itself,
right.
Which I think is super important because that's implicit in the call "No Blood for Oil," right? It's that, and remember all the stuff about Halliburton and whatever. I think it was a very vulgar materialism, but at least there's a materialism there, right?
Yeah, that's right. There was I was reading a lot of stuff that reminds me. I mean, it really was. I mean, the sort of thing haunting all this whole conversation in some ways is 9/11, because it was the thing that I think launched a lot of people, including me, because I was like a young dude who was just out of college and had sort of not really thought too much about these issues.
Are we the same age?
I was born in 1978. I'm 43.
Okay.
I'm 43. Yeah.
So you're like a year and a half older than me. So we're about the same age.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm ancient when I talk about things like this, like
totally,
like 9/11 and whatever. So let's get Gen X about it. Sorry.
Yeah. No, 100%. And when I think about that moment around 9/11 and the years after, it was definitely like, if we're around the same age, then it was a kind of searching age already. You know what I mean? You're sort of already like kind of thinking about like, what does everything mean and all that sort of shit. So 9/11 came at a very, very particular moment, and I was ready to read more and learn more. This is when like I think I got a Howard Zinn book and like started figuring out things about American history and things like that. And oil was very, very present in all of that material. This was when like Naomi Klein was very present on the left scene, if you recall. I mean, she still is, but maybe not as big as she once was.
No Logo made her like the younger, like the Gen X sort of like representation of progressive politics. This like kind of adbusters-y, sort of like anti-consumerist.
Where did that go?
Oh, that I think that went the way. I think that went with economic crisis. Now I think the idea of affluenza maybe doesn't have the same hit it had in the 1990s.
Yeah. No, it's true. We did Reality Bites on this show recently, and it was just like, holy shit! Like these kids, like their complaints are so insane compared to how you would think about making a movie about young post-college people today.
It's
a totally different economic reality, I guess. But yeah, the 9/11 thing made me think about oil, and it was movies like Syriana that were, I mean, Traffic was another one. I feel like Syriana is made by the same people. It's like
I think it is.
like,
yeah. I forget the guy's name. God, I should. Yeah.
Steven. So Syriana. I got the Wikipedia, dude. Syriana is written and directed by Stephen Gaghan. And it has like a lot of the same cast members as Traffic, but like it's got the Soderbergh crew, you know.
Yeah. It
George
feels very
Clooney.
Soderbergh.
Totally, yeah. And it's funny because one of the things that stuck out to me in reading material around Syriana is that this term hyperlink cinema. This idea that there were films like this that sort of threw a lot of like conspiratorial ideas at you at once and sort of made you want to go to the internet and almost like in a weird way duplicated an internet search. I feel like Syriana, and when I'm watching it now, it didn't seem confusing to me at all. It felt actually like 15 years have gone by, and it feels like the culture caught up to Syriana in some way. Attention deficit disorder cinema.
Yeah, and also I think like we're more comfortable maybe now than we were 15 years ago with sort of known unknowns. You know, I think that like the real complexities of our problems, certainly it's much more clear how complex they are than it would have been in the 1990s. Like the 1990s, when both you and me were teenagers, it seemed like the main political question is how long is it going to take for freedom and democracy, American style, to spread across the globe? And then when you have 9/11, you have for about 5 minutes the why do they hate us question, which is, you know, got shut down very quickly, like the day after or so, right? And it was a rally around the flag moment. And conspiracism itself starts to take up a lot of space that maybe today we would see organized towards left projects. Conspiracism ends up becoming this both online and also real world phenomenon, because if you're at an anti-war rally, which I was, you know, went to many of them around the time, including the giant one in New York, which was like 500,000 people, just an insane amount of people in New York. You saw the no blood for oil signs everywhere, but you also saw the Bush did 9/11, investigate 9/11 stuff. It was kind of part and parcel of the same thing. A deeply paranoid time, right? Yeah. Syriana is a movie, is a deeply paranoid movie, it seems. Similar to something that would be created back in the 1970s. And I think the 70s and the period right after 9/11 are both periods where our politics and foreign policy very tied up with oil, and B, all of a sudden things started to become a lot more confusing than they had been. Yeah. The average American has to sort of try to grapple with things that they wouldn't before. So maybe Syriana is like the Watergate movie of the 2000s.
Totally. No, it feels that way. And and I was definitely sort of captivated by a lot of that, I don't know, conspiracism of that era. I mean, I remember, fuck, man, the 2012 prophecy.
My God, yeah.
I mean, I wonder, like, what's the like Venn diagram overlap of like the people who were into 2012 and like MAGA people and like, you know, like the New Age, yoga, Burning Man community, because it feels like I was totally like sort of like tangentially connected to a lot of that stuff online. I was very interested in it, reading about it. I thought a lot of it was like front of what I considered like anarcho left culture to me. Yeah. But it's weird to look at it because do you see it the same way now? It doesn't seem the same to me.
I feel like conspiracism in general, and I believe that there are true conspiracies, by the way. I'm not like an anti-conspiracy theorist guy.
Of course not. No, I love that stuff.
Yeah, I love it too. I'm deeply fascinated by it.
I want to believe. I'm in that, I'm in that category.
I am too. I find that shit really, really fascinating. I also find at the end of the day that it's woefully incomplete, just like Syriana is a really good take on the complexities of American foreign policy and intelligence and economics in a period of let's say imperial decline. Let's say much as I think that's powerful. No, I'm also a Marxist and have become one since 9/11 did not make me a Marxist. In fact, what made me a Marxist was the financial crash, which happens 7 years after that, where kind of the chickens come home to roost on a lot of what we were doing at home and in the world. So
That'd be a cool T-shirt, man. Like on the front, 9/11 didn't make me a Marxist, and then on the back it says the 2008 financial crisis did.
Maybe I'll make those up or something like that. Make a little side sales on merch, but no, like because the spectacular act of violence that seems to come out of nowhere on September 11th, 2001, I think was very amenable to a certain conspiracism, and we see that still to this day. There's still people who hold that position, but I think what it ends up doing at that early date, before 2007, 2008, is it ends up really, I think, distracting a lot of people from, say, the anti-war movement, or constructing some sort of analysis and critique that can incorporate the spectacular act of terrorism and violence into the oil politics, which is, it's a good place to go. And a lot of people got there back then, right? But then to step back once more and start to understand how the global economy works, and ultimately how capitalism works, and how empire works as well.
It makes me think of this very memorable evening I went to I think it was just like a week after September 11th. I have a picture of it somewhere. Maybe I'll post it with this episode, where I went to it was like a left gathering about 9/11. And it was in downtown LA at like some old church, and Michael Moore was going to be speaking there. I don't think Naomi Klein was there. But during Michael Moore's speech, people started saying, Bush did this, Bush did 9/11. They started saying all that. And Michael Moore was like, no, like, let's not get into that. Like, he was because he's like kind of an old lefty, and he was just kind of like, let's not do that, because we need to figure out how we're going to position ourselves. Like, this is a really dangerous moment. And, things were nuts. Like, the tone of things were so nuts at the time. I don't blame anyone for screaming whatever.
Oh, my God. People who aren't of a certain age, it's hard to I don't know, to gainsay how completely insane the politics from 2001 to really 2008. I'm not saying that Obama solved everything.
Right.
But, like, under the Bush administration, things were really, really hairy. But at the same time, the only real opposition that there was at that point, there weren't a lot of like independent socialists out there. Maybe they existed, but they weren't very loud. There was only really the Democratic Party at that point, and John Kerry.
That's right.
And this is why, ultimately, if you look back on the anti-war movement, and do you think that this film, that the filmmaker would have considered this part of like an anti-war oeuvre? Or
I'm glad you asked that, because I was thinking of the same thing. I was sort of like, well, what is this? What is Syriana really about? Like, why'd they make this movie? What were they trying to do? Aside from the whole death of the author shit, like what is Syriana about? I mean, it seems like it's a film that we should be deeply troubled. We're supposed to be deeply troubled by the things we see, right? Like, it's a disturbing ass vision. It's not, what I like about it is it's not a like single conspiracy film. Like, there's not like one evil person. It's actually like kind of a dialectical movie in the sense that it's like showing you like all these moving parts and all these helpless people caught up at different levels of involvement and not really knowing anything. I mean, the George Clooney character is really fucking tragic to me, and that's weird for me to say, because he's like, he's basically like a CIA assassin.
The reason why you say that, I thought about this too. The reason why you say that is because he's probably the most sympathetic character, right? Because Matt Damon, through the plot of the movie, Matt Damon's son dies at a party. He gets electrocuted in a pool. A pool owned by a prince of like what's supposed to be Saudi Arabia.
They never say Saudi Arabia.
They never say.
No,
you couldn't say that in 2005. You might not be able to say it now.
Amazing, that's scary shit.
But then Matt Damon ends up being implicated in this himself, because he ends up getting bought off. He ends up becoming an economic advisor and getting a huge contract from the same guy whose pool electrocuted his son to death and ends up destroying his marriage. Part of his character arc is him getting like pulled into this corruption. You know what I mean? Through this tragedy that happens. The George Clooney character is, as you say, like portrayed as a very it's like a hangdog, tired, exhausted, cynical, but still believing CIA agent who has a lot of experience in the Middle East, including in Beirut, where part of this movie is shown. And you get the sense, of course, that he's seen some horrific times in his day. Terrific times in his day, and that he's kind of like towards the end of his career. But the reason, I think what's interesting is that the film wants us to feel bad for him, wants us to in some way like kind of I don't know, see ourselves in him. He's like this crusader for justice in the CIA, and I think that's actually one of the limitations of the movie, right? Is because you have the very liberal limitations of the movie. Like, I'm not trying to judge it as something it isn't. It's got a very liberal mindset, and so the CIA agent is a guy who's trying to do right and ends up getting screwed over for it by powerful figures. There's no question, really. There is a question. It's kind of like in the background, but like, why is he doing these things? Like, what's the CIA really doing in there? Is it actually good stuff? Is he just a guy who's trying hard to do good stuff, or is actually our entire, intelligence apparatus over there built on propping up dictators and, overlooking human rights violations, and most importantly, again, making sure that the oil still flows. That's like implied in the movie, but the CIA agent being like an otherwise like good warrior for the U.S. government is like shows some of the limitations.
Yeah, no, I agree. You got to have that for the story. It feels like some sort of bridge. I can't decide if I would want it to be. This guy is so alien to me that I just hate his guts. I don't know. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the film is sort of couched in Americanness still in a weird way, right? Yeah. It's like bringing us this story, and we're supposed to be sort of troubled by it. And I don't know. There's a moment I think that happens to people on the left that happens again and again and again, and I saw it at these you see it at anti-war rallies and demonstrations and meetings and stuff. It's like, well, what are we supposed to do about any of this shit? And I think that the conspiracy people in part just like the fantasy and like the story and like that. It's just like it's there's no action that comes from it.
There can't be. They're like globalist lizard elites or whatever.
Right.
Like it's a very pacifying type ideology to believe in, because there's no active subject, no agent of history that can do anything except maybe you appeal to like the QAnon conspiracy. You're assuming that there's like good guys in the back who are going to sort this whole thing out for you in the end. You're going to look at like collect all the dots together, but eventually like the white hats in the deep state or whatever are going to overthrow the Democrats and the lizards and stuff. And like, there really wasn't much to do in the 2000s after the Iraq War, which is I was going to say before. There's like we had an anti-war movement, which again we were both part of, or at least participated in. Never was it a matter of, as we've seen in many places in the past, a matter of like disrupting goods, a matter of taking over government buildings, a matter of like going down to the ports and stopping things, going to the recruiting stations and like blocking them up. Things that we saw in the 1970s. Yeah. What it was the anti-war movement was an appeal for politicians to listen to our voices and make a different decision. It always had that limitation built within it. It never presumed that like direct action or a class movement, let's say, could be built in order to stop that. And that's very like it's a very like America 21st century way to look at like a huge situation like invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, we had the immediate forerunner to the anti-war movement around the Bush years was the battle in Seattle, which was such a important moment for a number of reasons. But I mean, one of them was just recognizing that the state was organizing like new levels of repression, new kinds of violence to mete out against the left. But the other one, for me at least, was like a growing awareness of environmental activism and climate change. I mean, also all the WTO stuff and understanding that there was like global capitalism and all of this stuff was connected to the world and it wasn't just like an American thing. All of that was important to me. But like the environmental element of it, you talk about like direct action. What's really scary to me is like there was like the Animal Liberation Front, like all these different like environmental, like I don't know if you've seen like documentaries about that shit. It's
the Green Scare,
right? Because
a lot of the war on terror aspects they brought in with the Patriot Act were tried out in the 90s on the left.
That's right, and they put special circumstances on on certain crimes that were associated with like property crimes. So you're talking about like if you are an environmental activist or an animal rights activist and you destroy property, you can be put in prison for life for those sorts of things. And I thought, I mean, to me, like that era, that like Obama era, where those sort of acts were coming out, and like I remember Bill Maher like screaming at like these like 9/11 like inside job people that were in his audience. He was like, "Shut the fuck up! You don't get to fucking say that on my fucking show." And he's like, he's really grandstanding against it. But I felt there was a turn against like any sort of like conspiracy, inside job stuff. Like Obama sort of, in a lot of ways, like he was an anti-left sort of figure in that way. And he like there was a coalescence around like, we're done with all this fucking wacky shit. And part of the wackiness was like animal rights, environmentalism. Like that to me is really, really scary. And so watching Syriana is sort of like kicking back to an era where there was more of a like, I don't know, intense investigation publicly of what the fuck was going on.
Yeah, and not, the people don't talk about it now, but there was discussion on the left, even the left of the Democratic Party at the time when, Obama was elected and then soon to be inaugurated, about whether or not to hold trials, committee hearings about what actually happened in 9/11, but more importantly, to do stuff about the lead up to the war in Iraq, because we're talking about a world historic crime.
Yeah,
I mean, let's not put too fine a point on this. The American people were led by their nose, and I remember the drumbeat to war, and it was intense. And you saw it. I opened the paper one day and I saw the yellow cake uranium thing. I said, these motherfuckers are going for it.
You knew
I didn't
it,
know
right?
that
It was
much
a
at that time.
Sickening feeling, yeah.
And I knew enough about history at that point and to say, God, they're gonna do it and they're gonna get away with it. There was no stopping that train as it left the station. But there are, of course, no consequences, and even less than consequences, because now that Trump came in and was an even worse or like even more disruptive president than George Bush. Bush is now the nice guy. He's back on the Ellen show, and he's at least he wasn't Donald Trump. So there was no reckoning whatsoever.
Yeah.
In our society, and that kind of hangs over us, I feel like.
Oh, totally. I don't know if you saw the Card Counter, the new Paul Schrader movie, but it's about Abu Ghraib, and it's like totally it's interesting, like a counter to Syriana, because like Syriana is like, here's like a earnest attempt to try to understand the mechanics of oil politics and how all of it contributes to violence and poverty and all these horrific things. Whereas the Card Counter and these other movies that come out now seem like they're more like interested in just sort of like weighing the spiritual toll on the nation and sort of like how fucking guilty we all are. Because the no accountability for Iraq, and not only no accountability, but then like people saluting with tears in their eyes over figures like Colin Powell and others who were responsible for it, is just so fucking dark, dude. Like really, really dark.
Really, really dark. I mean, there's, another good part of the movie was the migrant worker vignettes.
100%. Yeah.
That narrative.
That was one of the things I remembered most about the movie. I haven't seen it in 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw it around when it came out too. But watching that, so for people who haven't seen it yet, you should probably watch it and then turn the episode back on. There's a migrant worker from Pakistan, actually a father and son. And as is the case nowadays with the Gulf states, they end up getting work in the Middle East. They end up working for Connex, right, the oil company that's kind of at the center of this drama, this big merger of two giant American transnational oil companies. And anyways, they get laid off, and it shows the younger son. He's in his 20s, presumably. The younger kid, like his progression from being unemployed and not having any options and being disrespected, losing his dignity, also being assaulted by security officers, and then being brought into a madrasa and eventually groomed into becoming a terrorism at the end. I mean, that is a pretty powerful story. Like Syriana does try, and I think it does a good job in a certain extent to show the sort of economic backgrounds of these different, these characters, right? Because it's getting into this earnest question of like, how do terrorists get made? When even though, as we know from the 9/11 hijackers and many other terrorists, it's actually not often unemployed and laid off industrial workers who end up becoming terrorists. It's more likely middle class and like educated people who end up turning to it, because it's very much like like a vanguardist. It's almost like a pseudo Leninism, some like the Salafist ideology.
Yeah.
And it draws people who maybe 40 years ago would have been, say, pan-Arab nationalists. They would have been followers of Nasser or Sadat or something like that. It takes this sort of like historical injustice of what the American Empire and British Empire has done over there, and it turns it into this sort of militancy.
That's a really interesting point, dude. Like the idea that the terrorism coming from a middle class, because it is something that you see as a trope in movies like Syriana and others, that were sort of like, well, terrorism is a result of impoverishment and people that have been sort of left behind, and that violence is a part of that. But yeah, I mean, you see that in the United States as well. Like the people that stormed the Capitol, weren't exactly like doing that because they were the deprived masses. You know, it seems like
they were radicalized middle class, suffering an attack on their dignity, suffering an attack on their identity, and on their social power, because there's economic parts of it too, obviously. But like, or their freedom, I guess they would say.
Right.
But similar to how the real story of Iraq and Afghanistan are not actually fully down to no blood for oil.
Right.
Just like that economic aspect is like crucial and you can't drop it. Neither is the international terrorism, the Al-Qaeda stuff, all the way down to just economics either. There's this imperial apparatus. So even at the time, even as like an anarchist at that time and a budding Marxist who was invested in a sort of economic analysis of empire and stuff, I knew already at that point in time, and I'm convinced of it even more now, that no blood for oil, while it's a catchy and it was a popular phrase among many of the left, it doesn't really do justice to the actual complexity of what was happening. Because as we know, so much of this is tied into Israel and tied into Saudi Arabia, tied into trying to maintain a unipolar world, tied into, importantly, and I know that you had tabs open for petrodollars, you were saying,
right.
But importantly too, it's about the threat and use of mass organized political violence on the part of the United States in order to uphold our hegemony over the global capitalist system.
There you go.
It's about making examples of people, and it's about also showing that our threats actually mean something, and trying to, in a period when China is rising this entire time, as we know, right? And as there's this sort of like chaotic period after the glowing Clinton years, it's American hegemony, American dollar supremacy, America military might that is being exercised at this point in time in order to maintain America's role as the global hegemon. For example, people were trying to, I'm sorry if I'm going off.
No, please, I love this.
People like, I remember Noam Chomsky and others.
I was just going to say, hegemony was like the buzzword around that time too. Like, and understanding all of this stuff was part of being like, I don't know, hip to what was going on, was understanding that the United States played this role. But yeah, oil tended to come in and flatten it, I feel like. It flattened.
And let me just give the one example I was going to give, because I think it's an important one, is that you had Noam Chomsky was writing articles about, and others were writing articles about like an oil pipeline that was going to be running from Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, I think it was, running into the Middle East. And people were trying to make a one-to-one correlation between the creation of this pipeline, the necessity for this pipeline to get those petroleum reserves out, and America's decision to invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, not being a country that has any oil. There's no blood to spend on the oil.
I think I remember this
so
now, this
people had to try to
story.
Yeah. People had to try to insert oil into the story, where maybe it was a small part of it, but it was more about, again, America flexing its muscle and showing that its military might would be willing to be used. If you know what I mean.
And I mean, in some way, to some extent, wasn't the Iraq War successful for the United States? I mean, the United States eliminated a dictator and sort of eliminated an enemy of Israel, and did flex its muscles, made billions and billions of dollars for a number of of U.S. elites and other rich people around the world. Trillions, right?
Trillions. The war on terror has made trillions, which, let's talk about it. Let's talk about petrodollar recycling.
Right.
Go ahead. Give us the
Dude,
the
I was hoping you were going to explain what the fuck petrodollar recycling is, because honestly, part of what Syriana, to get to back to Syriana, part of what this movie was part of, for me at least, was there's that moment where it's like Tim Blake Nelson's character is yelling about Milton Friedman, and he's talking about capitalism, and he has this really cynical attitude about don't you understand that all of this is just power and money. And to me, that was because the word capitalism only comes up two or three times in this movie. Yeah. And those were the keys to me. In other words, replacing the word oil with capitalism, no blood for capital, I guess would be what movies like Syriana were asking me to do. And I don't know if that was the filmmaker's intentions,
right.
But it definitely made me think of systemic things. It definitely made me think about how all of this is connected. And I still don't know what the fuck petrodollars are, dude. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Petrodollar, basically the way to understand American power in the world. It's not just merely that we were the only industrial power really left standing and unbombed after the Second World War. It's also that in Bretton Woods, the United States had the ability to force, first of all, Britain, who had been the imperial hegemon before us, but then, of course, all of Western Europe and much of Asia to operate under a currency system, operate under what's called a rules-based international order, which is code word for empire, that we ourselves designed. And the cracks in this start to appear right off the bat. 1944 was the Bretton Woods Conference. Things are already dicey by the late 40s and into the 50s, as America basically rebuilds large parts of the globe using grant money and loans in order to basically stop the spread of communism. So now we're in the global Cold War. By the time the 1970s come, what happened was the oil producing powers had ended up becoming a cartel. They had become a thing called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, countries. And it was this oil that they had on their soil was such an incredible material prize that it ended up creating imbalances between the amount of dollars that were going out and dollars that were going in, and especially the ones going to places like Saudi Arabia or Iran or other large oil producing places. There wasn't a reasonable place in order for those dollars to be spent. So these petrodollars are floating around without a place to invest it, because Saudi Arabia, right, it's a desert. You can only invest that in so much infrastructure, and they did. And then they're we still have all of this, and it was creating these imbalances. Part of which is what ends up knocking the United States off of the gold reserve system.
Right.
Nixon in 1973. So an ingenious way is figured out in order to recycle, as they say, to bring back to the United States all these errant dollars that are floating around and causing basically the dollar to drop, which is recycling them through some aid, but mostly through military transfers. So when people are well, why does Israel need $2 billion in military spending, or grants to the United States? That's all military spending. Saudi Arabia, tens of billions of dollars in military spending. And what that does is allow those dollars to come back to U.S. defense contractors and fix that imbalance. And so the petrodollars scheme then is that you actually have to have a highly armed and violent Middle East. The places where the oil are, they have to have some American product, and that American product is military hardware and military trainers and stuff like that. So that's kind of that's at the center really of this sort of world system,
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of thing that I feel like some of the better documentaries of that era were getting at, and part of it. It's interesting how much has changed, because Syriana, there's a moment where I think it's Clooney's character who says the world is running out of oil. He
Peak
kind of like
oil.
repeats the peak oil thesis. And he's like, the world is running out, and that's going to be like the rest of our lives is sort of like dealing with the collapse of civilization from that. But then like, and he even says that like, 90% of what's left is in the Middle East, and that's why like this is a duel to the death. And Matt Damon's character says duel to the death, which was a nice call to his current movie, The Last Duel. From the past, he made that call. But they say it's a duel to the death. It's in the Middle East because all the oil that's left in the world is there. And I accepted that when I was younger. I was like, oh, well, that's definitely the story. Like anyone who doesn't get that, then doesn't get that piece of it, obviously can't understand. Like the world is not comprehensible without knowing that. You know,
right.
And then at some point, you know, during the Obama administration, Obama's like bragging about like fracking. The United States is becoming this huge oil producer. And by the end of like Obama's term, he's bragging like, I made us like one of the number one oil producers in the world. And like 100%. That turnaround is fucking insane to me because it totally changes what I was kind of came up in. The early conception of being like a leftist or an anti-capitalist or whatever was on a lot of thought about oil that changed dramatically in our last few years.
It's incredible if you see the graphs. If you see, so the first person to come up with peak oil was a guy named Hubbard in the 1950s, and he had some graphs, he had some statistics, and he thought that the oil was going to run out in the United States in the 1960s, and then in the world in like the 1970s or 80s. You had to keep looking at the data again as peak oil didn't come. What we knew in the 1990s, because I remember these conversations too, and the 2000s, as peak oil turned out to be peak easy oil, like all of the easy reserves.
Right.
But because there was never a move away from fossil fuels, and because you're talking about an industry worth $2 trillion, okay? $2 trillion is what the oil industry, imagine the resources at their disposal. What you could, of course, do is design new methods in order to do that weren't nearly as obscenely profitable, but still relatively profitable, given, you know, a price of a barrel of oil sufficient in order to get that stuff out. And so technological innovation has meant that is there even peak oil anymore? I mean, it takes 5 times the resources to get a barrel of oil out of the tar sands in Alberta, for example, but you can still do it as long as there's one last fucking drop of petroleum in the ground that's accessible and refinable to be turned into oil. We will use it. No matter what the fucking consequences are, we will use it. And so the peak oil thing is interesting because it's almost like like people were talking about this back in the era when, so in the 17th and 18th century, if you look at a place like Great Britain, like England, where the Industrial Revolution obviously starts, where industrial capitalism in general begins, right? The sources of water power they had were insufficient, and people had cut down basically all the forests. So nobody had any idea where the energy was going to come from in order to continue to produce. And lo and behold, somebody figured out the coal-driven steam engine. And then, as you know, coal for another century and a half, you know, coal is the centerpiece.
Thanks a lot, motherfucker. Like that, that doomed us to centuries of this shit. It makes, it makes me wonder about, and this is, I think, in part what like drove a lot of people into like, I don't know, conspiracism and that kind of, I don't know, Joe Rogan world was just sort of like thinking about like these issues on like the large scale, you know, and being like, we're just apes, man, and we're just apes who figured out how to fucking take oil out of the ground, and that's what, and like part like that's good. I understand what's compelling about that to people, honestly.
Oh yeah,
you know what I mean? Because like part of me is like, well, shit, are we like just is it really that thing they say in the movie, which is like, you know, my grandfather rode a camel and I drive a Mercedes and my grandkids will ride camels? And you're sort of like, well, shit, like, are we really like gonna like be like this oil era generation, you know, that's just like we lived? Because I mean,
I think about that too, actually. I've thought about that a lot.
It's insane because I mean, the left has this, what I've seen happen in especially like the young left in my life, and you've seen it too, obviously, which is like an explosion of like left interest in like left politics from young people. But also like an eclipsing of like the anti-consumerist left and a kind of the whatever was like Burning Man sort of coming to terms with what we've done with oil and industrial society and all that sort of thing. Like that's kind of been eclipsed by, you know, a different kind of left. And in our lifetime, and that doesn't really, I don't know, doesn't really think about those things in the same way. And not that the people in the '90s were solving anything with their Burning Man festivals.
But
I think about it a lot. Yeah,
it ties in. I mean, Occupy is this real turning point too, obviously, and Occupy Wall Street ends up diverging, of course, afterwards into left and right wings. Like not necessarily Joe Rogan, but somebody like Tim Pool was an Occupy Wall Street person. Kirsten Sinema,
that's right,
was an Occupy Wall Street person.
Yeah.
Michael Tracy was a Occupy Wall Street person. Glenn Greenwald was talking about how great it is. So like Occupy kind of ends, I think, a certain phase that maybe picks up from 1999, and then that dips off after 9/11, and it picks up again, but seems very kind of antiquated today.
Yeah, totally.
In this particular era, I mean, the crisis. You talk about like living in the oil generations. You're only talking about like 6 generations,
right?
Between 5 or 6 generations between when oil becomes like the main driver of the economy, and all this wonderful energy, which is so cheap and available to everybody, becomes this sort of essential part of capitalist civilization. I mean, what's fucked up about living in the today and the here and now is that Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House in the late 1970s. Ronald Reagan tore them off the first thing that he did when he got into office.
Fuck your solar panels, Jimmy Carter. Yeah.
It's not for like, and that's the other thing too. Maybe the movie kind of made you think about this a little bit, right? But like, it's not. And on the one hand, it's automatic, right? That there's so much fixed, so much capital, so many goods have been infused with this need in order to use petroleum in order to survive, that like it's very, very difficult to get out of that too. But also at the same time, the actual like the power of these oil companies having $2 trillion and what that means that you're not dealing with an abstract fight again, like of the environment versus oil. What you're faced with ultimately is a fight between humanity surviving on the one hand and the capitalist class on the other.
Yeah.
And hopefully maybe that's something that people see more now because, like I said, good Lord, these people are going to burn every last fucking drop, no matter what it means for anybody. So it's not like in the movie where like it's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that's in question. How are we going to legally confront the corruption of these oil companies? It's not about like running out of oil, all the oil is going to be over there. It's like literally, how can we defeat the most dangerous fraction of the capitalist class to ever exist in human history?
Yeah. No, well said. I mean, it's funny because I think that the no blood for oil and the sort of oil politics that I was drawn to in that era, in part, it was like, it was a dead end. And yet it was like peak oil was a way of imagining something transformative, if that makes sense. It was like, well, I don't have to do anything because the oil's going to run out. And I think I underestimated the ability of these incredibly powerful institutions to keep the oil flowing. And like, to me, it's like, it's weird because there's like, I don't know, this sense of, okay, what do I do about hating the fact that we're strapped to oil this way? It's not like I can just boycott oil, like
it could make individual lifestyle decisions for sure. But what's that gonna make you feel good about yourself? Maybe.
Yeah, I don't drink oil anymore.
What, like that other movie, Three Kings? We could have watched that too. Did you ever see that movie?
Totally. 100 times. I was thinking about Three Kings definitely during this because it felt like that was another one that what's that? David O. Russell, right?
I think so. Yeah. Ice Cube was in it. And Clooney was also in it. Clooney, the good the good liberal out there in Hollywood representing anti-oil politics.
Well, also I was thinking that he plays the same CIA character in Burn After Reading. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
Yes, I have. Yeah,
but like he's also sort of like a bumbling CIA dude in that movie. Three Kings is probably one of the best I think war movies about the war in the Middle East. What are you looking at?
I just looked it up. It came out in 1999.
Yeah,
I assumed that was after 9/11.
No, it's about the first Iraq War.
Right? Yeah. Holy shit. Oh, Mark Wahlberg's in it too. That's hilarious.
Spike Jonze. Yeah, that's a good movie, dude.
Yeah,
And that's
well, maybe we'll have to do another episode on Three Kings. Continue this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. It's good talking oil with you, man.
Yeah, we're gonna make it a thing. We're gonna do like Oil Cast or something like that. A special presentation of Nostalgia Trap and Antifada.
You know, we should have. We missed the boat on it because oil was the hot topic 15 years ago. I don't think anyone gives a fuck about oil anymore.
We're bringing it back, bro. We're bringing it back. Yeah, I mean, America doesn't have to worry about oil like it used to, but oil politics. I mean, the world of Syriana is still very much real. Like the Syriana story very much matches the story of a guy named James Giffen. Did you discover this guy in your travels?
No.
Okay, so let me find this article right here. This guy, James Giffen, was actually indicted by the United States in 2003 for foreign corrupt practices. And he was actually released in 2010 with just like tax evasion because he had been similar to the Matt Damon character. He was part of this oil bribery scheme because he became an advisor to the Kazakhstan president, the same guy that was almost overthrown like a week ago.
No shit.
This guy, James Giffen, was basically caught taking a bunch of bribe money, and paying off like his child's like Swiss boarding school money, and paying off various like officials and whatever. And so the crazy end point of this story is that it's Nazarbayev, right? The guy who's like still in power now, barely, who almost gets overthrown. He was at the center of this back then, but also too that he alleged. And the reason why he got off is that he said he was working for the CIA the entire time. And because the CIA never coughed up the paperwork for it, the judge had to be like, well, we don't know. He could have been in the CIA. Let's just drop the charges. So crazy shit, man.
Yeah, I didn't know that would work.
It just works. Apparently, if you say the CIA sent me and they deny it, you just get to go free.
Man, I'm gonna use that if I ever committed any major crimes and get caught.
Yeah, me too.
If I ever
open container, speeding.
How about burning property for environmental activism?
Ah, there you go. Like, what's that Andreas Malm? I have this book, which people can't see, Fossil Capital.
Fucking A, that looks heavy. Now. So let me, hold that up. That's that book is a Verso book, right? Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming. Holy shit, man.
It's like a Marxist analysis of like the history of fossil fuels and energy use that basically talks about how this whole situation that we're in came about, understanding fossil fuel capitalism as a particular stage of human development. But Andreas Malm also wrote, what's it called? How to Bomb an Oil Pipeline?
That's right, yep.
Yeah. So maybe that like Animal Liberation Front, Earth Liberation Front thing is going to come back now. Maybe everything old is new again.
Yeah, they're going to have to stay off the internet if they're going to want to do shit like that.
Yeah.
No blood for steam, I guess, is the.
He talks about in this book, and I haven't completed it yet, about how implicated coal was in the suppression and the discipline of the working class, because it's actually water power was far more efficient to use at that time, but you couldn't move production to where workers were cheaper.
It's so fucking scary that like things like that is how capitalism and the logic of it like sent humanity down paths that like we're cursed to live on those paths now. That stuff is like endlessly horrifying to me. I mean, there will be blood. The opening of that movie really captures like how like I don't know, just the digging through the grime of like finding this shit, and then like immediately workers are being killed in that movie.
Yes.
And the grime is part of it. That's intense shit, man. And a
$2 trillion industry, and you know how many people work in it? 500,000. Those aren't even production workers. That's just in general.
Jesus.
So imagine the incredible amount of profits that are being made when you're just literally like a milkshake sucking that out of the ground.
That's cool, man. Keep the Wi-Fi flowing. I'm okay with it. That's a good place to end. Is just letting everyone know that we're okay with gross, disgusting capitalism as long as the lights are on and all that kind of shit. That to me is what I think this conversation in part was about, and what I wanted to talk to you about is sort of like that contradiction, because no blood for oil seemed to come out of that, but it's sort of a dead end conversation that we're stuck in. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think you're right about the sense that people had that there was an out, that there was like an automatic process or like a purely resource-based process that was going to save us from ourselves, essentially, right? And as it turns out, capital will continue to transmogrify, will continue to innovate its way into continuing to use whatever is the most profitable, unless there's some sort of political fix to that. And the United States, unfortunately, I mean, some European countries, even China, is doing a better job, I think, of trying
their eyes are wide open on this shit.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's fodder for future conversations. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, David, this was awesome. I'm glad to finally podcasted with you.
Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Sean from Antifada. Go check out that podcast if you haven't already. Go check out our Patreon. Go outside and look at the sun. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.